Welcome back. In the last lecture, we looked at several strategies that effective writers use to organize their arguments. Drawing on examples from Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense, we learned how arguments can be structured and presented in order to successfully guide readers from one point to the next. We also looked at methods for avoiding structural flaws and inconsistencies that could distort or obscure the main purpose or goal of an argument. Remember, when you are writing anything, you want to carry your reader along on the current of your words and ideas. You don't want them to get stuck, to have to go back, to reread, to try and figure out what the heck your main idea is and where you're going with it. In this lecture, we'll build on our discussion of how arguments can be organized by examining a closely related and equally important quality of persuasive writing. And this important quality is the selection and the presentation of evidence. More specifically, we'll study key strategies you can use to effectively support a written argument. In later lectures, especially 15 through 18, we're going to look at some rhetorical concepts that you can use to supplement and complement these strategies I'm going to talk about right now. And with those supplemental strategies, you can make your arguments even more powerful. But for now, we're really going to examine the basics of how you use evidence to make a claim. So I think we need to start by establishing a crucial but often overlooked aspect of supporting an argument. And I can't stress this point enough. Evidence does not explain itself. In fact, I think this point is so important. Let me repeat it. Evidence does not explain itself. To write persuasively, you have to show your readers how and why your proof is relevant to your argument. And what I mean by this is that it is never sufficient simply to refer to a piece of evidence in your writing and then expect your readers to make a link between it and the claim you're trying to support. That's asking them to do the kind of work that you should be doing in your writing. Now, your audience certainly may be smart or intuitive enough to form this kind of connection without your help, but they might not interpret the evidence in precisely the way you would like. Or, even worse, they might interpret it in precisely the way you would not like. So by way of example, let's think of a courtroom TV drama like Law and Order. And we're all familiar with this. Have you ever seen one of the lawyers on the show simply introduce the murder weapon into evidence and then say nothing about it? Your Honor, I'd like to submit this bloody kitchen knife as People's Exhibit A. The prosecution rests. Okay, so what's wrong with this approach? Well, first of all, you've got about 22 minutes of TV time that you have to fill in the order or the courtroom portion of the show, and just presenting the murder weapon and having the prosecution rest is not going to cut it. And as you can obviously see, the bloody kitchen knife alone does nothing to prove the prosecution's case. Now, if the prosecution can establish that the prime suspect bought the knife, was seen with it chopping tomatoes 10 minutes before the murder, and then throwing it, covered in blood, into the garbage can 10 minutes later, well, then you've got something. And it's the same thing, the same idea when we're dealing with evidence in writing. So a crucial step in supporting an argument is to provide a convincing explanation of how the proof you're using adds weight to and validates the claims that you're making. In order to marshal your evidence to provide the most persuasive argument possible, you should try thinking of yourself as a prosecuting attorney in a first-degree murder case. And you should also think of yourself as a prosecutor who's fortunate enough to have the actual gun or knife or lead pipe or candlestick or whatever it was that the accused party used to commit the crime. Or, if it works for you, think of yourself as one of the actors on Law and Order. In such a scenario, it's important to recognize that even with the murder weapon on display, it is not sufficient, it is not enough for you, as the prosecutor, to walk over to the evidence table, point out the murder weapon, and proclaim, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the actual weapon used in the homicide. Here it is, sitting right on this very evidence table. Now, thank you very much for your time. I know you will find the accused party guilty of murder in the first degree." That's just not going to work. Similarly, if you're trying to get people to care about, say, saving endangered sea turtles, you can't simply write, "Studies show that sea turtle habitats are half the size they were 20 years ago." Okay, now we're back to that "so what" question. You need to explain how and why the decline in habitat size is important to the survival of the sea turtle. For all your readers know, sea turtles may have found it tiring to swim so far and are delighted to have less territory to cover. Okay, obviously I'm being kind of facetious here. We can all probably figure out that decline of living area, it's not a good thing for any animal. But when you're writing and you're trying to convince someone using pieces of evidence, you need to really spell out the significance of that piece of evidence to your argument. In fact, failing to adequately explain how a piece of evidence is tied to your argument could have the unintended, and I'm pretty sure, certainly unwanted effect of actually undercutting and diminishing the power of your proof. So what's at stake is not just the possibility that you might miss a chance to make your argument stronger, it's also the possibility that you might end up making it far weaker. And certainly, that is not something that you want. A good prosecutor would need to offer a detailed and comprehensive explanation that connects the gun and the alleged killer. She or he would want to cite forensic reports, and if it's a knife, it'd be a forensic report on the blade. If it's a gun, ballistics reports. The prosecutor would need to talk about the wound, the angle of the attack, fingerprints, crime scene photos, testimony from eyewitnesses, and any other sources that would help convince the judge and jury that the murder weapon is a valid piece of evidence and persuade them to view it in a way that supports the argument for a guilty verdict. So, how do we determine whether or not we're providing a relevant and substantial explanation of how our evidence supports our argument? Again, we need to think back to the so what test we used in Lecture 6 to gauge the effectiveness of an opening to an argument. The same logic applies when we shift our attention to supporting that argument. We need to tell our readers what the evidence is, but we also have to show them why that evidence matters in a particular way. Let's look at an example from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. In this segment of his argument, Paine is addressing the status of monarchy or hereditary succession as a form of government. More specifically, he's debunking the notion that monarchies are especially good forms of government for preventing civil wars. Here, what he's doing is specifically addressing a claim that was made in favor of monarchy, and he's addressing that claim head on. So he says, "The most plausible plea which hath ever been offered in favor of hereditary succession is that it preserves a nation from civil wars. And were this true, it would be weighty, whereas it is the most barefaced falsity ever imposed on mankind. The whole history of England disowns the fact. 30 kings and 2 minors have reigned in that distracted kingdom since the conquest, in which time there have been, including the Revolution, no less than 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions." All right, so you can see that Paine answers the what question by invoking a set of concrete historical facts as evidence to support his claims. And then he frames them with some really highly charged emotional language to try and play on his readers' sympathies. What part of the passage demonstrates Paine's use of objective historical evidence? Take a moment, think back. What's the objective evidentiary part of the claim? of the passage. That's right. He points out that under a long-running monarchy, there have been 30 kings, 2 minors, and there have been no less than 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions. Pointing out the ratio of kings to civil wars and rebellions is really a crucial step in his argument. Eye-popping statistics like these have the potential to be tremendously persuasive. Statistics alone, however, are not enough. As in the hypothetical murder case scenario I described earlier, you can't just point out the evidence and then leave your audience to connect the dots and come up with the conclusion you want them to reach. Payne recognizes this, and he includes 2 phrases that give an emotional, subjective spin on his presentation of the statistics. So think back and see if you can identify what those phrases are. They might have jumped out at you as you were listening. When he says, "The most plausible plea which hath ever been offered in favor of hereditary succession is that it preserves a nation from civil wars." And then he goes on to say, "Were this true, it would be weighty, whereas it is the most barefaced falsity ever imposed on mankind." And he continues, "The whole history of England disowns the fact 30 kings and 2 minors have reigned in that distracted kingdom since the conquest, in which time there have been, including the Revolution, no less than 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions." Okay, so listening to that passage again, what words jumped out at you? They're really not that difficult to catch. It's barefaced falsity and distracted kingdom. Those 2 phrases, when taken together, suggest both a deliberate attempt to deceive and a willingness to be distracted or diverted. So how does Payne want his readers to interpret the evidence he cites? It's not just a matter of throwing numbers out there and expecting them to identify the disconnect between what people say the monarchy does and what actually happens under monarchical rule. Payne also wants them to recognize that there's a complex process going on that gives rise to this disconnect. It's a process in which everyone seems complicit. At least they are to some degree. He says the aristocratic elite, the members of the ruling class, are to blame because they perpetuate the, quote, barefaced falsity of the claim that monarchy prevents civil wars. Yet, he says, the mass of people who do not hold power, the, quote, distracted kingdom, must bear some of the blame as well for continuing to believe in the capacity of the monarchy to prevent civil war when there's so much evidence that this, in fact, is not the case. So, what we have in this brief argument by Payne is a very effective example of how to cite evidence and how to explain the way it should be perceived and interpreted. Now, probably it's very likely that you've encountered arguments in which proof was offered up without any specific or concrete reason why the evidence should be interpreted a certain way or lead us to one particular conclusion rather than another. Arguments that rely on statistics or the findings of scientific studies are especially prone to this kind of mistake. My favorite example, and pet peeve actually, is the raft of arguments out there for and against the health benefits of coffee drinking. Now, I have to confess, I like coffee. I like it a lot, and I'm always hoping to read a solid argument in favor of drinking more of it. I'm originally from Seattle, and as some of you may know, it's practically a law there that every citizen in the city has to consume several cups a day. I mean, honestly, you really can't go more than 200 feet in Seattle without finding a source of coffee, and it's one of my favorite things about that city. Now, obviously, I may be biased in this regard, but as you can imagine, I am nonetheless extremely pleased when I come across a piece of writing that assures me that I am doing good things for my body and my mind when I drink my favorite latte. Of course, always in moderation, right? And while it's easy to find articles that tout the benefits of coffee drinking, it's not so easy to find articles that use evidence convincingly and responsibly to make that argument. And here, it's not a lack of evidence that causes this problem. In fact, there's this quite substantial, amazingly large cottage industry among researchers who devote their time and energy to examining the effects of caffeine consumption on rats. It really is quite amazing. You can find study upon study dedicated to measuring and evaluating the effects of caffeine on the cognitive abilities of rats, on the immune systems of rats, the kidney functions of rats, on the neurological health of rats. I could go on and on and on, but I think you get the idea here. Now, let me just be clear. I don't have any quarrel with these studies. I have no doubt that they are, on the whole, well-conceived. I'm sure they're carefully conducted, and I'm sure they're scientifically valid. And of course, I always hope the rats are enjoying their caffeine as much as I enjoy my coffee. But there's another cottage industry that's sprung up alongside the scientific studies, and there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of articles and blog entries that draw on this research for evidence to support arguments about whether coffee is bad or good for you, and in what quantities human beings should or should not consume it, and things like whether when you drink your coffee is as significant as how much you drink. And I think you get the idea that I'm trying to get across here. And this is where the problem is. When it comes to supporting this argument, the subjects of the scientific studies are rats, not humans. And the caffeine that the rats are getting is not the same thing as coffee. And of course, it's really easy to conflate caffeine and coffee. We often do that ourselves. We think of those two things as being almost interchangeable. But they're really not one and the same. It's not precisely true that caffeine equals coffee or coffee equals caffeine. And any argument that relies on evidence taken from a caffeine rat study has to include some explanation of how those effects, positive or negative, can support a conclusion about the effects of coffee drinking on human beings. And perhaps more importantly, whether I should feel smug or guilty about my third cup of the day. I tend to feel smug and delighted. Full disclosure. Without careful explanation of how this evidence needs to be considered and attention to the context and differences between rats and humans, this argument is really nothing more than speculation based on possible association. The scientific evidence about rats and caffeine might suggest some correlations, but without a solid explanation as to how such evidence supports an argument about coffee drinking in humans, we have absolutely no basis for believing the proof that these writers cite that it's valid one way or another. Now, on the plus side, for me and my caffeine-addicted self, the lack of an explanation of the evidence's relevance allows me to dismiss any arguments that would get between me and my grande skinny vanilla latte. See, I've got the terminology down. On the negative side, this same lack might allow me to dismiss out of hand some proof that there may be downsides to downing another cup or 2 or 3 or 7 every day. So what can we learn from these interesting but ultimately flawed attempts to link evidence from studies of highly caffeinated rats to conclusions about heavy coffee-drinking people? Well, if the first key point we learned from the murder trial scenario and the excerpt from Thomas Paine was that you, the writer, have to provide an explanation of how your proof supports your claims because evidence does not explain itself, then the second key point we have to keep in mind, courtesy of those highly caffeinated rats, is that the connection you make between your evidence and your conclusions has to be strong. The claims you make based on evidence have to be direct, they have to be definitive, and they have to really work to show a clear cause and effect relationship. If your connection is not direct, if in order to get from point A to point B, we have to wander around for a while, if it's not definitive, if it's not clear and easy to see, and if it's not based on a clear cause and effect relation, and if instead you're relying on association or speculation or what we'd call correlation, you run the risk of undercutting your argument rather than supporting it. Now, there's one sort of warning or caveat here, and it's true that association, speculation, and the appearance of correlation can actually have a really persuasive effect on an audience. There's absolutely no denying that these strategies for presenting evidence can convince people to do or believe certain things they might not otherwise do or believe. And I think if you just think about it for a moment, you'll realize that nearly all forms of advertising and marketing rely in some way on the willingness of people to be persuaded by claims and arguments based solely on speculation and association. For example, ads for shampoo, we've all seen them, and they tend to show people with beautiful, shiny, lustrous hair. And the association here is clear. We're meant to draw a conclusion that's really quite simple. Use our product and your hair will look like this. Now, this association is pretty basic, but ads for things like cars and laundry detergent take it a little further. Buy our car, an ad seems to suggest, and by association, beautiful women will want to go out to dinner with you. Right? We've all seen those kinds of car ads. Another ad might suggest, use our detergent and your home will be a place of order and sunlight with beautiful, obedient children. Look, the advertisers want you to think, that woman's home looks like it's been in Architectural Digest. She uses WonderClean. If I use WonderClean, maybe I can be the kind of woman with a house like that. We all instinctively know this. It's really just marketing 101. Still, although the association thing can work, the most effective and lasting arguments don't rely on these kinds of approaches. They certainly do, and they can make use of emotional, non-objective language, just like Paine does in his argument against the supposed virtues of monarchy, right? When he says barefaced falsity and distracted kingdom. Those are terms that are laden with emotion, with associations. They're not objective. But they don't combine empirical proof and emotional explanation to make speculative or specious claims. In other words, someone like Paine, even though he's using non-objective language, he's not trying to use it to support a claim that can't be supportive. And someone like Paine is not misrepresenting, either knowingly or out of ignorance, the relevance of his evidence to his conclusions. Instead, a good writer like Paine would give you a strong piece of evidence and then explain how and why that evidence is important. Now, just a moment ago, when I warned you against relying on speculation, association, and correlation as strategies for framing evidence or proof, I also acknowledged and admitted that these methods do in fact hold significant persuasive power. That act of acknowledgement, my admission that such approaches do work in many cases, is a classic example of our third key strategy for supporting an argument. And this third strategy is the use of concessions. So when I noted that the advertising and marketing campaigns often persuade people by presenting evidence in less than forthright ways, I was, in fact, conceding that their approaches must have some efficacy. They must work. They must have some chance for success, even if the methods themselves are faulty. My willingness to concede this point is an example of how admitting that alternative viewpoints and methods exist can have I think it's like a seemingly paradoxical effect, but it's a real effect nonetheless. It has a seemingly paradoxical effect of strengthening your own position or argument. This may seem at first totally counterintuitive to some writers. Why acknowledge the validity of some idea or approach that could compete with your own? Wouldn't that undermine the argument you want to make? As we'll see from some examples, just the opposite is true. Rather than undermining an argument, concessions can actually strengthen it. By acknowledging and dealing with counter-evidence, you establish yourself as a reliable and trustworthy commentator on a particular subject. Here's an example of a concession from Paine's essay. He says, "Some writers have explained the English Constitution thus. The king, say they, is one, the people another. The peers are a house in behalf of the king, the commons in behalf of the people. But this hath all the distinctions of an house divided against itself, and though the expressions be pleasantly arranged, yet when examined, they appear idle and ambiguous." All right, what is Paine conceding here exactly? Well, he's acknowledging that other writers have offered an explanation of Great Britain's government that sounds well-balanced and rational. Yet, as he continues to argue, this appearance of balance and rationality really belies a hierarchy of power that favors elites while granting little authority to commoners. So in other words, this model, while it might seem workable on the surface, if you look beneath it, you find it's really not satisfactory. Paine uses this concession to highlight, by contrast, the possibilities for government in America that he sketches out later in his essay. And specifically here, he talks about the possibility for a balanced, rational legislative system that does not favor one particular group, a group of elites. In the American system, Paine argues, appearances will actually match up with reality. And this is not like the British system, in which appearances of equal representation really mask long-standing structural inequalities of economics and political power. So he's saying the British model may look like it's giving everybody power, but it's not at all. It's important to recognize here that Paine uses a concession to highlight and support, by way of contrast, his own position. In other words, he's not necessarily giving ground to his opponents. Rather, he's sketching out their argument as a way of bringing his own views into sharper relief. He's underscoring the best parts of his case, even as he shines some light on the weakest parts of the opposite case. It's also important to recognize that Paine is using this concession to bolster his own credibility. Mainly, he's doing this by demonstrating that he thoroughly understands and has a full command of other points of view related to this argument. His concession shows that he's done his homework, so to speak, and he can offer a detailed assessment of the pros and the cons of other possible positions on the topic. Again, we're more likely ultimately to be persuaded because he has anticipated and addressed a piece of evidence or claim that runs against his own position. He hasn't tried to ignore it or obscure the other point. In fact, he's done just the opposite. So when it comes to supporting an argument, we've identified 3 crucial points. First, the need to explain how a particular piece of evidence or proof works in your favor and helps you make your case to an audience. Second, we discussed the need to provide a clear connection between the evidence and the conclusion that you want your audience to reach. This needs to be a direct connection rather than an association. It's got to be definitive rather than mere speculation. And it has to be based on cause and effect. So we have to be able to see the clear connection. Third, and finally, we learned how concessions, acknowledging the arguments of others, can actually serve to amplify and strengthen your argument, in part by highlighting the features of your point of view as opposed to somebody else's, and also by showing how credible you are as a writer, how thoroughly you've studied the strengths and weaknesses of other positions while establishing and consolidating your own. In the exercises that accompany today's lecture, I want you to work on this. In particular, I want you to work on writing, say, an editorial column or a letter to the editor, and when you're doing this, to try and work in a concession as you're making a claim or a point. In our next lecture, we'll move on to a discussion of how you can conclude the essay in the most effective way possible. You want your audience to recall as easily as possible the main points of your essay, to understand how they work together to support your main claim, and you want them to remember your evidence as being clearly relevant to the matter under discussion. In other words, you want to take them out with a bang, and in our next lecture, we'll discuss just how you can best do that.